Alright, I received some questions following my presentation, Kabbalah Explains Anti-Semitism. Here's the first question. What about another video explaining why Jews call non-Jews Goyim? Alright, I understand the question. It sounds like it is some sort of a derogatory term, right? Goyim seems to be perceived as a slur or an insult, but it's a complete misinterpretation. And let me show you why. First of all, the word itself. Goy, which is in Hebrew spelled this way, simply is another word for Am. Now that doesn't tell you anything because that's in Hebrew. But the meaning of this word is simply nation. A nation or a people. Goyim equals nations. So why the distinction between Jews and nations, Jews and the rest of the world? The reason is that Jews are not a nation. What do I mean by that? Kabbalah explains that Jews are a group that was created from representatives of ancient humanity. Let me explain. Some 3,800 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia, there is a turning point in human evolution. For thousands of years, human beings are developing with an instinctive connection to each other. The further back you go in history, the more human beings are instinctively connected to each other and to nature itself. Over time, for years and thousands of years, human beings evolve, and what they develop is their sense of self, their self-consciousness. They become more individualistic, more self-centered, more aware of themselves and wanting more for themselves. And this is a process, an evolutionary process that Kabbalah refers to as the growth of the human ego. 3,800 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia, there was a person that you all have heard of who was actually one of the first Kabbalists, and he understood the dynamic. He saw what was happening. He understood that nature has to increase the human ego in order for human beings to increase their level of connection. And that in fact, this is how all of nature works. It creates more diversity, more complexity, more individuation, more differences, and then a higher level of reciprocity, cooperation, communication, connection. So, what happens there in ancient Mesopotamia? Humanity was made up of all kinds of natural clans and tribes and groups and, if you will, nations. And so, what did Abraham do? What he did was putting together a group from representatives of all those groups and tribes and clans that existed in ancient Mesopotamia, and he brought them together as a group. And since then, there's a distinction between that group that went with him and the rest of the nations, the Jews and the Goyim, which literally means nations. Question number 2. The Yehudim, the Jews, did not exist until the tribe of Judah, one of Jacob's 12 sons, right? What is this that Yehudim originated in Babylon with Abraham? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Please explain. Okay, I will. So, 3,800 years ago, Abraham gathers representatives from all the different tribes and clans of humanity back then. And then over time, that group acquires different names that are all related to its purpose. Let's dwell on the purpose of that group for a second. Abraham discovers that the growth of the ego is a natural dynamic. It's a natural evolutionary process. It has to happen. Why? Because this is how nature creates more conscious life forms, and more specifically, a more conscious humanity. Now, that enables human beings to consciously raise their level of human connection and thereby gain conscious contact with each other, but also with that guiding force of nature. Now, whether you call that guiding force of nature the upper force, the higher force of nature, the oneness of nature, or the creator, it's the same thing. In fact, Kabbalists explain that in Gematria, which is the numerical value of the letters in Hebrew, Hateva, which means nature, there you go, and the Hebrew word for God, which is this, Elohim, are both equal to the number 86, which means the totality of nature and the word God are synonymous in Kabbalah. The preeminent Kabbalist of the 20th century explains that in his article, The Peace. So that group that was aimed at that group that followed Abraham in order to raise consciously their level of connection to each other and to nature, they acquired different names over time. And all of those names are related to that purpose. The Israelites comes from Israel. What is Israel? In Hebrew, Israel is written like this, and it is a combination of two words. Yashar, which means straight, or directly to, let's say, and El, which is a short for Elohim, that higher force of nature. And so Yashar El, which is the meaning of Israel, is actually these two words, which means directed to the higher force, straight towards the higher upper force of nature. Take another name, for example, the Hebrews, right? That's another name for the same group of people. So in Hebrew, that is Ha'ivrim, the Hebrews. That comes from the word Ever, which basically means to go beyond, la'avor. It means to go beyond, to pass, to transition, to rise above. It all is talking about the same thing, rising above the human ego to the other side of nature, to the higher force of nature. Take the word that everyone is familiar with today, the Jewish people, right? That comes from the word Yehudi. Jewish means Yehudi, which originates in Yehud, which means unity. And that's exactly what that group, that Abrahamic group, was all about. Finding unity above differences. So above the growing natural trend of more differences, more ego, more individuation, which has to happen. It needs to happen in order for human beings to evolve. But then it enables them to consciously raise their level of connection above that, and thereby discover the governing system of nature itself and gain a conscious connection, a conscious contact, not just between each other, but between them and the force that guides the revolution, the higher force of nature. Question number 3. This one has several parts. I'll break it down. Assuming Abraham was a real historical figure, the implication of some of this is that many more nationalities than we realize from that melting pot in the Middle East migrated to the Levant together with Abraham. So, it's not that Jews and other nationalities came together with Abraham, because Jews did not exist before Abraham put that group together. And he put together that group from representatives of all the different tribes and clans and groups that existed in ancient Mesopotamia. In other words, from all those nationalities. So there's actually nothing special genetically or biologically about the Jews. They were representatives of all of humanity that came together with Abraham. This is the thing that seems to be difficult to digest here. Sure, they lived for thousands of years together, and on the physical level, on the biological level, they exchanged genes between each other, and they have some common genetics from that physical development, that biological development for a few thousand years. But that's not the point, and that's not what matters here. What matters is their spiritual evolution, their spiritual development. When I say spiritual development, what I mean is they made this spiritual connection, this higher level of human connection above the growing ego. And that is what brought them together as a group. But in fact, they were people, just like everyone and anyone from any place in the world today. There were many different groups there in ancient Mesopotamia, and Abraham called upon anyone who had that inkling, that desire, that inclination to follow his path. Everyone who felt that beyond the differences that are now growing, beyond the growing ego, that there has to be a force of oneness, that there has to be a common humanity that we all share, and that it comes from nature itself. And those people who were sensitive to that message, they were the people who followed Abraham and became that group. Alright, the second part of the question is this. The other implication is that the Jews have jealously held on to the know-how that can take humanity back to some previously interconnected and therefore peaceful state, prior to our ego having a sudden unhealthy outbreak. And finally, that the world has been, and still is, beating up the Jews to pass this knowledge on to the rest of the world, and will continue to do so until they have. Alright, thank you for the question. Not exactly. You see, after Abraham puts that group together, they spend about 1,500 years living amongst themselves, developing, evolving separately from the rest of humanity. So they develop their own way of life, they develop their connection, go through some ups and downs in terms of their unity, and in terms of how they work together as a group that reaches the scale of a nation. And then about 2,000 years ago, the human ego goes through another leap in its evolution. It reaches another peak in its development. And so that happens in humanity as a whole, and it has to happen. It's a natural dynamic. This is how nature evolves humanity. And so because that happens now, the Jews lose their conscious connection. They scatter around the world. They begin to roam around the world. And so today, 2,000 years later, we're in a very unique state. On the one hand, the vast majority of Jews, almost all of them, are unaware of that method of human connection, that Abrahamic original method that brought them together, or in other words, the authentic wisdom of Kabbalah. On the other hand, anti-Semitism never disappeared, meaning the sentiments that exist in the rest of the system of humanity, in the rest of the human network, they didn't go away, they didn't disappear. They always mutate and take on different forms according to different times and places, different cultures, and different rationalizations. But the sentiments themselves don't go away. And so Kabbalah explains that they will not go away. It will not disappear by itself until the entire network, the whole world, rises to that higher level of human connection that puts humanity in contact between human beings and themselves, but also with that higher guiding force of nature. And that's also why our world today is entering all those risks and global challenges that come from the fact that we have become interdependently connected across the globe on the one hand, and on the other hand, our ego, the human ego, has never been more fully developed than it is today. And so we're reaching a certain tension between the growth of the ego and the growth of human interdependence across the globe, which will require us to rise to a new level of connection. Question number 4. Kabbalah and the Zohar supposedly teach the death of the ego, restriction, and sharing. Okay, you've been looking into some of the Kabbalah material that we have online. Great. Do the boys at Goldman Sachs do those things? How about the Jewish owners of 90% of American media? How about the Zionists imprisoning millions of Palestinians in Gaza, or the Jewish ownership of most of greedy Wall Street? I ask sincerely. Okay, I'll answer you sincerely. I may or may not agree with the examples you brought up and those details, but that's besides the point. It's irrelevant, because the crux of your question really is this. I see that Kabbalah is talking about this positive evolution of human connection, and on the other hand, we see Jews doing things that we perceive to be opposite to it. The answer is very simple. Jews, just like the rest of humanity today, the vast majority of them have no awareness of the authentic wisdom of Kabbalah, and they don't practice it. And so the growth of the human ego that took place in humanity as a whole influences all human beings. And so it's natural that you will see egoistic inclinations and actions taking place in the whole of humanity across both Jews and non-Jews alike. Just because someone is of Jewish descent today doesn't mean that they practice the wisdom of Kabbalah or even that they know about it. That being said, I do understand where the expectation is coming from, because from the moment that that group, that the Jewish people was formed, it was formed in the human network, and the human network is an integrated system. We're all interdependent and interconnected, and everything that happens in a certain place, let's say, happens in the entire system. It has effects in the entire system. Think of our body, right? Our body is comprised of some 50 trillion cells, and so if something happens in one organ in the body, it has ramifications and effects, and it is interdependent with what's happening with the whole body. And humanity is the same, meaning that from the moment that group was formed, was shaped and created, it was created in the system, and the immediate result is that there is a deep-seated demand and expectation from that group to deliver what they had, because it's all part of the evolutionary process that we're going through as a collective superorganism that is humanity. And that is why there is this deep-seated demand from the Jewish people, which is inexplicable, which is something that is irrational even. But there is a certain expectation from them to deliver something that they're not delivering. Lastly, a frequently asked question is this: why does Kabbalah even go into these topics? Why go into getting involved in these topics like anti-Semitism? The reason is simple. Kabbalah explains that instead of trying to blur and delete the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, instead of trying to cover it or downplay it, we should face it and understand that it's there and it exists, and we all need to understand where it's coming from. Kabbalah explains that instead of killing the messenger, we have to try to read the message. And the message is that there is a deep reason for that sentiment that people have towards the Jewish people. This is something that has to do with our interconnection of humanity as a whole. If we begin to be more aware and conscious and knowledgeable about the root cause of anti-Semitism, if that begins to permeate the public discourse, what happens is that the flames of anti-Semitism will subside. It's not that we will solve the problem at once and everything will be okay if everyone knows, but rather it will direct the sentiments in a more productive, evolutionarily productive, so to speak, direction. It will reduce the violent manifestations of these sentiments, and it will begin to direct all of us in the direction of where we need to go, which is coming to a higher level of human connection across all of mankind. So, it's not the most positive topic to discuss. Kabbalah has a lot more to offer than discussing anti-Semitism. It's not even that convenient to discuss some of the time or most of the time, but it's necessary if we want to alleviate suffering. Alright, this has been the Q&A for the Kabbalah Explains Anti-Semitism presentation. If you have more questions, you're definitely welcome to post them in the comments below. I will do my best to answer them. Until then, all the best.